Welcome to session 4 of Living is Dying. My name is Sering, and we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and other lands, and recognise their connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Our topic today is Watch Your Mind. To guide us through this, I have much pleasure in introducing Ben Isbel, a mindfulness teacher with 25 years experience in both traditional Buddhist meditation techniques and contemporary psychological approaches to mindfulness. Up until recently, Ben was the research program coordinator at the University of the Sunshine Coast's Healthy Brain and Aging Clinic, doing valuable groundworking work investigating the use of mindfulness to prevent the development of age-related cognitive decline and dementia in older adults. Ben is so dedicated to mindfulness that his full-time job is now helping others through guided meditation and instruction in the comprehensive cognitive model of mindfulness he has developed. I'll now hand you over to Ben, and there will be an opportunity to ask Ben questions towards the end of the session. Please put your questions in the chat box, and as usual, remain muted during the session. Thanks to Ben. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sering, and thank you to everybody who's worked so hard on this wonderful program. I know a lot of work goes into providing these kinds of sessions, and I think that they're really important, that we have an opportunity to have a really honest discussion about death, which isn't always something we're happy to talk about, and it doesn't need to be a morbid conversation. So I think these opportunities are really lovely, especially to bring it together with the rich heritage that exists in the Buddhist tradition of how to deal with aging, death and dying. And of course, we're here to look at Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's wonderful book, Living is Dying. And I've been asked to read a little bit from this wonderful book, a small section on Watch Your Mind, and to talk a little bit about how mindfulness is relevant in this section. So that sounds like it's going to be an easy project. I think we've only got 2 and a bit pages to cover, but in Rinpoche's way, he has this special ability to pack so many very profound and interesting things into a very small amount of work. So even though we're just going to cover a couple of pages today, we may struggle to cover it all, is what I'm trying to say, because Rinpoche has provided us with such a rich text here to work with. So I'm very honored to be able to have the opportunity to share a little bit of my experience in relation to this text and see if we can follow along with Rinpoche as we go. Okay, so this session, as I just mentioned, is called Watch Your Mind. Now, just as a recap, we're just going to cover the last paragraph of the previous session, where Rinpoche was actually talking about this example of the muddy water. Just going to try and move this a minute. Just bear with me. There we go. And so there's a really interesting analogy that Rinpoche provides here of a glass of muddy water. And so Rinpoche mentions, think of a glass of muddy water. Even though the water itself is pure and clear, when stirred, it mixes with the mud, and what we see is muddy water. And we're all familiar with this, obviously. In the same way, our basic lack of mindfulness and awareness stirs up all manner of thoughts and emotions that then mingle with and muddy our pure, clear mind. And so this simple analogy is a very powerful metaphor for what takes place in our mind. And as Rinpoche identifies here, it's our basic lack of mindfulness and awareness which leads to a situation where the pure, clear nature of our mind is obscured, as it were, by the mud swirling around in this glass of muddy water. And so this analogy really hints at two very important aspects that we should take notice of as we go forward through this. So the first thing it tells us is about the nature of the thought and emotion that we are generally engaged in, that we generally occupy ourselves with. And as this analogy alludes to, the general characteristic of the thought and emotion that we generally engage in is to cloud and obscure our mind. And sometimes in the Buddhist tradition, these will be called the disturbing emotions. And this is exactly why they're called that, because their quality, their nature, through simply being present in our mind, is to obscure and disturb the natural clarity of our mind. So that's the first thing. It tells us something about a particular type of thought and emotion. And it also tells us something about the nature of our mind, because when these things simply settle, this adventitious disruption settles a little and the natural qualities of the mind can emerge. It emerges as pure and clear, as Rinpoche says. So we have a hint here about the nature of thought and emotion and the nature of our mind. And these two things are very different. And as Rinpoche says, this basic lack of mindfulness and awareness of this distinction leads us into the experience of being clouded. And so Rinpoche offers us a very nice little exercise to do here. So let's see what Rinpoche has to say. He suggests you can experience this, how this works right now. Stop reading for 3 minutes and look at your mind. Okay, so we might just do this actually. I mean, let's just sit for 3 minutes. And as Rinpoche says, let's simply look at our mind. So when we look, we're just observing. We're not trying to do anything. We're not trying to change anything. We're not trying to create anything. Simply looking, as in looking through the window at the outside nature. We're not trying to do anything to that nature. We're simply looking. So let's spend perhaps 3 minutes now just looking at our mind before we continue. So let's try that. You don't need to be doing anything in particular special. Simply observe. Okay, you can finish there. So how did you go watching your mind? I'm sure, like most of us, you had the experience of wondering, gee, there's 3 minutes going along all the time. I wonder if it's going to be like this the whole time. I didn't really sign up for this, or I've got so many other things I need to do. I can't just sit here and do nothing. But we've all have had this experience, right? And Rinpoche says to ask ourselves a few little questions. Ask yourself, how long was it before a thought popped into your head? How long before you started thinking about that thought? And how long before you were completely lost in that thought? So this is a really interesting process that Rinpoche is describing here. How long before a thought popped into our mind? Because we don't sit there and invite these thoughts generally. We haven't set out to have the thoughts that we had in those 3 minutes. We didn't invite them, we didn't plan for them, and yet spontaneously and effortlessly, this stream of content, our thought and emotions, rises effortlessly within us. So we don't really have any control over choosing what arises in any particular moment. We don't know what thought's going to come. So a thought just pops into our mind. And then once it pops into your mind, how long before you started thinking about that thought? And this is where an interesting phenomenon takes place. It's one thing for the thought to come, and those thoughts that come spontaneously and effortlessly, that in itself tells us something. From a psychological point of view, we could say that that thought popping into your mind effortlessly, spontaneously, and without your intention has all of the hallmarks of what we would call an automatic cognitive process or an automatic emotional process. And we've, over the time, adapted ourselves to automate things that we do regularly so that they become effortless and spontaneous. And so the fact that these thoughts come effortlessly, spontaneously, and without our conscious intention or awareness is a sign that these things have become our automatic thoughts, habitual patterns, however you want to look at it. And you can think of this in relation to any skill or anything that you do a lot, anything you think about a lot. And a really easy example is driving the car. And you can think about the very first time you learnt to drive the car, the first day as a teenager, perhaps, that you hopped in the car and tried to learn how to drive. And there's so much to check, and you've got to look at this, and there's pedals and indicators, and you've got to monitor everything that's going on. You've really got to pay attention. It takes effort, attention, and you've got to do it consciously. You've got to control your attention. But now, after driving for so many years, I imagine most of you can drive along and have a conversation to somebody, and all of the actions of driving the car take place completely outside of your conscious experience. You can drive home and not even know how you got there. We've automated a lot of these things. We've automated them so that we can drive our car spontaneously and effortlessly and unconsciously. And this is what happens when we automate things. They happen spontaneously. And so when we sit down for 3 minutes and our mind begins to wander, it shows that these are our automatic, habitual, cognitive and emotional patterns. So as I said, it's one thing for them to arise. And then we start to get involved in it. We start to grasp to the content of the thought. As Rinpoche says, how long before you started thinking about the thought? And this is where a difference takes place sometimes between when we have awareness and mindfulness and we can simply observe a thought without getting involved in it, grasping to it and becoming involved in it. Often we lack this basic mindfulness, as Rinpoche mentioned earlier, so that when the thought arises, we get involved in the content of our experience. And by grasping to the content, we get lost in that thought. A really interesting process called cognitive fusion, where we actually become the thought or emotion. And then that will snowball. And before long, as Rinpoche says, we become completely lost in all of that content, one thought leading to another, as he describes a little bit further here. The process of one thought leading to another is a familiar one. Imagine you are waiting for a friend to pick you up to take you to a party. You start to feel excited the moment you hear the toot of the car horn. Who will be at the party? What will be the food? What will be the food like? Will there be party games? Will it be fun? And before you have even set foot outside your front door, let alone arrived at the party, you are already lost in thought. And so this is describing something that we're very, very familiar with. So this doesn't really require much more explanation. We're all very familiar with getting involved in thought and getting lost in mind wandering. So Rinpoche continues, most of us lack any form of mindfulness. And so we never see how our minds get entangled in our emotions and our body's gross preoccupations about friends, families, values, philosophies, political systems, money, possessions, and relationships. For our entire lives, the awareness that is our Buddha nature is blinded, diluted, befuddled, blurred and dulled by unfettered thoughts, until we become so swamped with feelings, confusions, expectations, and complications that it's as if the nature of the mind didn't exist. And so this brings us back to that analogy that we just saw earlier about the jar of muddy water, the glass of muddy water, where it's all stirred up. There's a lot of turmoil going on. And so the mud has completely obscured the clear, pure nature that was always there. And so this is a really interesting thing that Rinpoche mentions. Most of us lack any form of mindfulness. So that's really, I guess, what I want to talk a little bit more about at this point, this idea of what this mindfulness is. So mindfulness is kind of a foundation that we require for most anything we do, certainly on the spiritual path, the practices that we engage in, but also in a mundane level. We need some level of mindfulness to be able to hold our attention on the task that we're engaged in, whether that's a conversation, reading a book, or any sort of problem that we're trying to work on. Because if our mind is continually being pulled away by distraction, we're not going to be able to be very successful in our task. Similarly, for any kind of spiritual practice, when we're studying, of course, we need to be able to keep our mind on the material that we're studying without wandering off to other things. When we're contemplating, we need to be able to maintain our focus of attention and remain with our contemplations without getting distracted. And similarly, with our meditation, mindfulness is the platform that we rest all of these three activities of study, contemplation on. So it provides a basis for us. And so that's in terms of how we engage in mundane activities and also spiritual activities. But on a much more intimate, internal level of watching our mind, as Rinpoche mentions here, without this mindfulness that is aware and can observe, we don't notice how our minds are becoming entangled in our thoughts and emotions. So I guess this leads to the question of what mindfulness is, and that's a little bit of a difficult question. We allude to it in this one aspect of keeping our mind on task, so a non-forgetfulness. Mindfulness can be thought of as non-forgetfulness, as holding something in awareness so that it's continually present. When we hold something in awareness, it is present and appearing before our mind, so we haven't forgotten it. And yet when we wander, then our focus of attention leaves that object and it's as if we've forgotten it. So we can think of mindfulness as non-forgetfulness, and we can apply that in many, many situations. But it also has this quality of awareness that we've talked about, awareness that looks and sees. One of the very interesting things that we can notice when we look and see at our mind in mindfulness practice is the distinction between awareness and distraction, being present and aware, or lost in mind, wandering and distracted. So this is a really important distinction that we need to become familiar with and make it clearer and clearer so that we're able to distinguish the difference between our mind being present and aware rather than distracted and absent. So this is something we need to generate an experience of. And for that, it's useful to have a technique. And so mindfulness training begins with a very simple technique. Commonly, we would use the sensations accompanying the breath as an object to not forget, to be non-forgetful of, to be mindful of. And so we use an object that's easy for us to find, that doesn't require effort, and that is something so simple, because when it comes down to it, this mindfulness is very, very simple. So really, as Rinpoche mentions here, the problem is we don't recognize this nature of mind. In fact, it's as if the nature of mind didn't exist at all. And this is really the great kindness of the Buddhist teachers, the Buddha himself, and the unbroken lineage of teachers up to the present day, where we have Rinpoche providing this explanation for us currently, to point out that such a nature does exist. Because it's true that we are constantly preoccupied with all of our friends, families, values, our thoughts, emotions, our plans, so much so that this clear, pure nature of our mind has become completely obscured to the point that we no longer even know that it exists. And so we need somebody to tell us, because how else would we know? And so this is the great kindness of this Buddhist tradition, not only to tell us that this nature exists, but also to provide a path and a method for actually introducing us to discover that for ourselves. Because it's no good us finding it somewhere else. If it's in our own mind, we need to discover that, which means we need to figure out what our mind is. We need to learn how to recognize our own mind, to experience our own mind, and then work with our own mind. And I think especially for a lot of us who are Westerners, who are brought up in this Western materialist scientific culture, this question of mind is a very tricky one. And so we need a very simple and skillful technique to be able to find this thing, because currently we don't really acknowledge that mind exists. We're very good at knowing the objects of awareness, and we've become very, very skilled at investing all our knowing into the objects that we know, so much so that we've very much forgotten that there is a knower of these things. For simply, without a knower of the object, there can be no object known. And so there's an imbalance. We've invested all of our knowing into the objective aspect known by our mind, to the detriment of experiencing the knowing quality that is the mind, the knower itself. And so this is where mindfulness can be a very, very powerful technique to begin this introduction, where we can begin to experience and recognize mind, so that we no longer have questions and confusion about what mind is. We have an experience. So how does this work? Well, mindfulness takes us from where we are. We're very familiar with objects, so let's focus on an object. In fact, let's use the breath, just the sensations accompanying the rise and fall of the abdomen, wherever they're most prominent. So the technique here is to begin to get our mind to settle on one object, so that we can begin to examine how we know this object. The situation currently is a bit like if there were a little bird flying around everywhere, very busy flying around, maybe like a hummingbird, and you were asked to identify, well, what kind of features does it have on the back of its neck, and what kind of feathers does it have on the tail, and what markings are there on the wings? Well, if the little bird is continually flying around everywhere, and we can't really even catch a glimpse of it, there's no way we're going to be able to distinguish, let alone understand what the nature of those markings are, what the colors are, what the shapes are, how it exists. And our mind is a bit like this. While we're constantly caught in this distraction, in emotion of planning, hopes, expectations, and involvements, our mind is flitting around everywhere. So the first task is to have our mind sit still long enough in one place that it rests on an object. And once it begins to rest on an object, we can start to pay attention to how we know this object. But we need to go firstly with getting our mind to sit still, which is why in mindfulness techniques, often the breath is used as a foundation for this development of stillness, stability of attention. So we're going to try this in a little moment, and I'll talk you through how this is going to work, but let me just talk a little bit about the technique itself. And we'll do it for 3 minutes, and we'll see how that 3 minutes compares to the 3 minutes that we just experienced before. So as I said, we're just going to place our attention on the spot where the sensations accompanying the breath are most prominent as we breathe in and out, allowing our breathing to be natural and relaxed without trying to change or create anything, simply observing the sensation of movement, tightness, lightness, those physical bodily sensations that occur with each rise and fall of the abdomen, wherever they're most prominent. But remember, the idea here is to get our mind to sit still in one place. And so we select the place, the spot where those sensations are most prominent for us, and we rest the mind on that particular spot. That is the anchor for our awareness, where we begin to rest our attention and just observe the rising and falling at that spot, because the key here is to get our mind to sit still. So as you've now no doubt recognized, a big part of this initial application of mindfulness is an attentional regulation, where we regulate our attention to remain on the breath, and each time we notice that it wanders, to return. And there's a little tool that we can use to help us with that. And it'll do two things. We can use a mental labeling tool to help us rest on the sensations accompanying the breath, so that we simply note rising as we observe the in-breath and falling as we observe the out-breath, just in the background of our awareness, noting rising, falling. And when we notice that we've wandered and we're thinking about something, we just note thinking and return to the rising and falling. But we want to do this in a particular way, not reacting to everything, not trying to hold on to some things and avoid other things, but rather remaining even, balanced, non-judgmental, not interfering with our experience by trying to create something or avoid something else. And this is an aspect of equanimity that we bring to this attentional mode of paying attention to the breath. And so if you want to know what mindfulness is, it has these two components. There's this attentional component which holds our mind on the object, the non-forgetfulness. But the attitude is one of equanimity, where we're not hoping, expecting, fearing, grasping, trying to change anything, but simply observing without reacting to whatever our experience may be. And so these two elements, attention and equanimity, constitute the mindfulness that holds our attention on the breath. But an aspect that's commonly overlooked in this kind of training is that mindfulness on its own is very liable to go astray. It's very liable to get caught up in one of our thoughts and just wander off for minutes at a time before we even begin to notice, which is why we need to bring our mindfulness together with introspection. This introspection, monitoring, checking, just being aware and vigilant of what our mind is doing, is a crucial component. We have to bring our mindfulness and our introspection together to successfully regulate our awareness. And in fact, this introspective aspect is the doorway which will open the door to our knowing mind. Let me explain a bit how that works. Introspection is going to check two things for us. It's going to check what we pay attention to and how we pay attention. So the what and the how. So what we pay attention to is the object. This is the objective aspect that we are knowing. In this case, just the sensations accompanying the breath. And each time introspection notices that we've lost this object, that we've wandered to something else, then we'll notice and we'll label thinking and come back. So that gets us to rest on the object by checking the what we are paying attention to. Once we're able to settle on the object continuously, then we start to check, how am I paying attention? How am I paying attention? How is not about the object. How is about the mind that knows the object. Is the awareness that knows. Am I knowing this clearly, alertly, vividly? Or am I knowing this in a dull, unclear, vague, heavy way as in tired and sleepy? Or rather, am I agitated and distracted and my mind's wandering everywhere? So what's the quality of my awareness like? Is it clear, vivid, or is it dull, hazy and heavy, or is it scattered and dispersed? This is our first clue into experiencing the knowing of an object, the quality of knowing. And this is the process of us turning the mirror from the thing known back towards the knower itself. This is why introspection and mindfulness are so important to come together to open our awareness from just being fused with the object to begin to become aware of the mind. Once this happens, we can then begin to make this distinction between being aware and distracted, conscious and unconscious, mindful and absent. And this is a distinction that comes out of our experience, not from thinking about it, not from reading about it, by simply observing just the sensations accompanying the breath and noticing when we wander. What is it like when we wander? Am I aware of what's happening around me? Am I aware that I'm even wandering? And what's the experience like when I'm able to just rest on the breath and be aware of everything that's happening around me? Let's try this for a few minutes. Let's try this for 3 minutes, just as we did before, and use this simple technique of observing just the mere sensation accompanying our breath with the mental labeling technique of rising, falling. Okay, let's begin. Again, you don't need to be doing anything special, sitting in a particular way. Simply observe the rising and falling as you breathe naturally and relaxed. Simply note rising, falling, as your awareness settles on the sensations of movement, tightness, accompanying the breath. And as long as our awareness rests on those sensations, we don't need to worry about any other thoughts or sounds or sensations. Simply continue with the rise and fall. However, if you lose the rise and fall because your mind has wandered, simply note thinking and return without reacting, becoming annoyed, frustrating, or getting caught up in that thought whatsoever. Okay, how was that? Hopefully this simple technique can help you just stay on track a little more rather than this diffuse kind of just watch our mind, which is excellent if we're used to that. But sometimes we need a little bit more structure, something to begin the process with, as I said, to allow our mind to settle. And so the simplicity of this technique is really good. Stanislav saying it's calming. Yeah, that's really an interesting phenomenon. Calming. Yeah, once we do this a little, then something very, very interesting can take place. And just be aware that the simplicity of the technique is its profundity, is the power, and will be what unlocks the qualities that we're going to look at here shortly. The utter simplicity of simply being aware of a sensation accompanying the breath without adding anything. Because we are very complex people and we like complex things. And so we say we like simplicity, but it's difficult for us a lot of the time because we'll have this simplicity of observing the breath, but then we'll be wondering if I'm doing it right. And I think it should be like this. And now I'm going to compare my idea to what's actually happening and evaluate it. And now I'm thinking it's not like that. So maybe I'll tweak it a bit and I'll try something else and then I'll continue to evaluate it. And you can see all of a sudden something utterly simple has become full of complexity, which didn't exist there in the first place. So the simplicity is the key to this. And as our mind settles more and more with this practice, then a funny thing can happen. As all of the thought and the content that we are so familiar with begins to settle, then if the nature of that thought is to disturb our mind, then as it settles, our mind becomes less disturbed. And we might have a glimpse even of a moment where our mind is just even for a moment, an instant, free of all of the normal agitation and movement that we are usually consumed with. And that moment is where we suddenly discover that actually, not only were those things obscuring my mind, but the mere absence of those things, even for a moment, has these qualities of peace, calm, clarity, insight. And we know that that is the nature of our mind in that moment, because the minute we start thinking about it, oh, I think I got it right, that was nice, and the thoughts return, we've lost that experience. And so we have a very clear illustration from our own experience of making a distinction between thought and emotion, confusion and awareness, free of those things. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So let's continue a little bit more and see what Rinpoche has to say here. At the moment of death, Rinpoche continues, whether you are a seasoned Buddhist practitioner, the CEO of Google, a Wall Street trader, or a materialist of any kind, the natural process of dying will force your mind to separate from everything you have ever known. Obviously, this means separation from your friends, family, house, the park, and the gym. But it also means separation from the one thing that has been with you for your entire life, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even while you sleep, which is your body. When you die, your whole body, including its most subtle elements, earth, water, fire, air, space, and senses, must be left behind. So clearly, being separated from everything we have ever known is going to be disturbing to us, yeah? Because all of those things that we have cultivated our sense of identity and self with are all being slowly removed from us, externally, then internally. And so clearly, if our entire sense of self is based on these things, then we're going to be very, very troubled when they start to be taken away from us. And this is kind of one of the wonderful aspects of the simplicity of this mindfulness practice of introducing us to our mind, because suddenly we're becoming introduced to our one true possession, our only true possession that we can never lose, which is our mind, the thing that is going to continue. Because what will continue when we die? Obviously, our friends, our family will be of no help to us at the moment of death. All of our possessions, our home, our resources, we won't be able to take a single thing, not even the clothes on our body. And even the body, the thing that we so closely identify as me, will be left behind. So you can see being stripped of all of these reference points, all these markers that serve us to ground our sense of self, when they're being stripped away from us. That's a very disturbing experience. And yet the mind is the thing that will continue. And so this is the great benefit of mindfulness practice, becoming able to recognize our mind, become familiar with it, and get used to what the experience of mind is like. Because this is the one true possession that we will carry with us. So the more familiar we become with this, obviously, the less fear we will have, not only in life, but also in death. A big part of this is going to be letting go. And you'll hear lots from other speakers, as we did last time, about fears and what the fear comes up at the time of death. You know, one of those is letting go, whether we can let go of all of those reference markers, all of our friends, our family, our home, our possessions, our body. And we can begin to train in this process of letting go and relaxing in this simple practice of mindfulness. You think about it a little bit, even to sit down and do one session of mindfulness. Well, the first thing you have to let go of is all of the other things you would like to do with your time. What else do I have to do? I'm a busy person. I have lots of important things to do. Well, if you're going to sit down and do a session of mindfulness, you have to let go of the other priorities and values that you place your time upon. And then once you sit down and begin to notice the breath, you're going to have to let go of all of the thoughts, ideas, plans, hopes, expectations, to remain simply observing the rise and fall. Not only that, we're going to have to let go of whether we enjoy this experience or not, because it's going to be difficult at times. It's not going to always be pleasant. So our reactions to our experience, and ultimately the one doing this, the special person who's doing this wonderful virtuous thing of practicing mindfulness, this idea of the one doing mindfulness. Because is that idea there in the simplicity of an awareness, simply observing a sensation? In order to reach that level of utter simplicity, so much has to be let go of. And this is a wonderful training for us in learning to let go of the things that we generally grasp tightly to. And so mindfulness can help us with this. And sometimes we don't have time to do a full session where we can sit down and follow our breath like this, like we have for a few minutes. And so once we get used to this sensation of letting go, we can just relax how we generally relax. If you've been working hard or carrying a heavy load, and you sit down, you just go, and that moment of relaxing, of dropping and exhaling with a sigh, it's like having a bundle of sticks and just letting them go. And they all just fall down. All our thoughts, our worries, our concerns. And this is the way we can connect to this simple space of relaxed, open awareness over and over again, anytime we like. Okay, I'm just mindful of the time, so let's continue so that we have some time for a little bit of discussion. So Rinpoche continues, while you are alive, everything you see, hear, taste and touch and so on is filtered through your senses, your eyes, ears, tongue, body and so on. By the time your mind experiences a perception, not only will it have passed through your sense organs and consciousness, it will also have been conditioned by your education and culture. This filtering process is what makes much of life possible. And this is something that we really don't pay attention to a lot because we just assume things exist the way they appear to us. But the very fact that they appear to us as they do is merely a result of the temporary condition of our human physiology. As Rinpoche mentions, our senses, our eyes, ears, tongue, body, all of these things are determining how things are going to appear to us, how the external world is going to appear to us, and we just assent to those appearances and assume that is what is out there, that is the external environment, and that's the way it exists. But even on a very simplistic level, we can just analyze a little and understand that there's no way to verify this. For instance, with our visual consciousness of seeing an object, the process here is that light of a specific wavelength enters the retina of our eye and hits the receptor cells on the back of our eyes, the cones and rods, and a particular wavelength of light will stimulate a particular subcategory of these cells, triggering an electrical impulse sent through the optic nerve up through the occipital cortex, where it's reconstructed through a whole layer of processing folds in our occipital cortex, where the color, the shape, the orientation is reconstructed. And that's important. It's reconstructed. It is constructed by our mind, by our brain, and then projected forward to our prefrontal cortex, where we say, oh, this is what I see. But when an electrical impulse is traveling via a nerve cell through just a mere chemical reaction of sodium and calcium gating to fire an action potential, how is that in any way a clear representation of an object? It's just a signal, and it's just a representation. So even from a Western scientific point of view, we can clearly see how everything we experience is entirely conditioned by our physiology, and therefore is just a projection of our own mind, a construction of our own mind. Okay. So that relates to our external environment. And clearly, as Rinpoche says here, our education and culture will be determining our internal environment. So everything is coming with this conditioning. So let's continue. Imagine you wake up one morning to find yourself in a strange place. Directly in front of you is a cream-colored wall on which 2 black semicircles and 2 circles have been painted. Instantly, based on your education and exposure to advertising, your mind interprets what it sees as cocoa, especially if you are nouveau riche and know nothing about perfume. Not having heard yet of Diaz and Durga, you may still believe that Coco Chanel is the best perfume in the world. This one I'm not familiar with, so I can't comment on the values of perfume, I'm afraid. While we are alive, Rinpoche continues, everything we perceive is interpreted by our conditioning and education, or lack of it. This is how we can name familiar smells like sandalwood, lavender, and the stink of stale urine in a public laboratory. It's also how we identify things. If dead oak leaves were crumpled up to look like tea and packed in a Fortnum and Mason's box labeled with an exotic name, many people would rush to buy it without even considering what it tastes like. And so we can see Rinpoche gives us many, many examples of how all of our experience is merely conditioned. It's influenced by that conditioning, and yet we become involved and grasp to it. And that conditioning is just like the mud in the glass of water that we looked at right at the beginning. And the conditioning is adventitious. As the conditions change, the conditioning will change. And so we are always subject to this conditioning. But what is it that is unconditioned? What is unchanging and abiding? Now that's what we get to next. Rinpoche continues. At death, the laws of nature shear away your physical senses, and the mind is left naked and entirely alone. As you no longer have eyes made of flesh and blood, everything you perceive is raw and unfiltered. Without eyes to filter your perceptions, cocoa on the cream wall looks quite different. So this sentence here, at death, the laws of nature shear away your physical senses, and the mind is left naked and entirely alone. This is a really really interesting topic, and one that I'm sure will be covered later in this program when we get to the painful bardo of dying, and we'll have some experts to talk about that in much greater detail, no doubt. And that's what Rinpoche here, I think, is alluding to, the process of death, whereas he says all of our physical senses will dissolve, the coarse levels of mind will dissolve, and as we proceed through the painful bardo of death, mind is left naked and entirely alone. And again, if we come back to the mindfulness training, how is it going to help in this situation? Well, we're constantly, as we said, involved in this spontaneous and effortless content, automatic patterns which are conditioned, habitual predispositions. And if all we've ever known about ourselves, all of the markers of our sense of identity, stability, of who we are, is based on all of these conditioned elements of our current sense of self, then it's going to be a very disturbing process when at death the laws of nature shear away these markers for us. However, if we've begun to have a little bit of familiarity and just open the door a little to this unconditioned nature and become acquainted with this unconditioned nature of mind, the pure, clear quality, then at death, we will have much less fear. And in fact, it's this process that will give us the fearlessness and confidence to face not only all of the problems that we experience in our own life, but hopefully at the time of death, to face that with grace and confidence and fearlessness. To get there, the simplicity is the technique. The utter simplicity of arriving where we're just observing a sensation of rising and falling. Just a mere physical sensation without adding anything. Just watch, as Rinpoche says. Watch your mind. So that's it, guys. Let's have a look and see if there's some questions in the chat. If you have some questions, please post them in the chat. I'll be happy to attempt to answer those as best I can. There's a question here. Thank you for this. It's a great reminder how simple mindfulness is very helpful. It's a bit funny how you said only mind will go with us after death. Mind itself at a certain level doesn't truly exist either. It's not a solid thing. Do you mean awareness? This is a really good question. Yeah, this is where we have this confusion a little bit that comes from not being able to really pinpoint what our mind is. And sure, we can make those distinctions between mind and awareness in a general sense. But if we take a bigger picture, one of the things that I quite like to do to clarify this, or to kind of see where we're at, is ask, what is our body? What is the nature of our body? What is our body? And generally people can have a really good answer for that. Cells, flesh, blood, bones, molecules, organs, skin, tissues. We have a really, really precise answer for that. But then if you pose the second question, well, what is mind? What is the nature of mind? Do we have an equally clear, precise understanding that we had in relation to our body, or not? Because sometimes we think, oh, maybe it's our thoughts, maybe it's our emotions, maybe it's how I feel. That's an interesting question, because where should we look for this mind? In the Buddhist tradition, they would say that mind is just clear and knowing, luminous awareness, immaterial, not composed of form, matter, particles, yet has the experience of knowing, this quality of experiencing. And as I said, we're kind of very used to investing all of our knowing in the objects, especially if you've come from a Western scientific culture. Then the only thing that really exists is the stuff we can measure, that we can quantify. And so where should we look for something that doesn't have those characteristics? How do we look for it? Well, if we use the same criteria that we use for the stuff, then we're not going to find it, because mind is not form. So it doesn't have shape, color, size, location, spatial orientation. It doesn't have any of these qualities. So where should we look? How should we look? By what criteria should we look? Obviously, none of those criteria are going to work. The only criteria we can use are our own experience. And that's where this simple technique can introduce us to that direct face-to-face experience of clear and knowing, something that's immaterial, unobstructed, yet knowing, and has the quality of experience. So yes, just because something doesn't truly exist doesn't mean it can't exist conventionally. Yeah. We're told constantly that the world around us doesn't exist truly, but yet it still appears and functions and exists. And similarly with mind. Okay. How long a grasping can last when we know the moment of grasping is gone? Yeah, this is a really good question. How long do we grasp at things? One of the really interesting insights that can come from mindfulness is our direct perception of how things exist. So the reason we do mindfulness is not to become more calm, less stressed, all of these side products. The reason we ultimately are doing mindfulness is to develop insight, wisdom which sees how things exist as they are. And you can call this the vipassana. Vipassana, higher seeing, seeing things as they are. We look and we see. And one of the most important things we can see is impermanence. And as long as we don't see impermanence, we grasp to permanence. And so it can seem like our problems are very real, solid, and abiding, and especially grasping, as the question asks. How long can grasping last? Well, it seems like it's there all the time, right? Especially if you don't let it go. I mean, you can bear a grudge your whole life if you really want.
Yeah.
But that's just a projection of permanence onto what is fundamentally changing moment to moment, this subtle impermanence.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, you have to keep renewing it. Keep putting
Somebody's hasn't muted themselves. If you can just mute yourself, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
And so as we become closer and closer to the simplicity of observing the breath, we'll notice that even our grasping, even our emotion and thoughts cannot bear to remain for even 2 moments in the face of awareness. Awareness reveals their nature, and their nature is impermanent. And the more we become familiar with awareness, knowing things as they are, and especially subtle impermanence, just the knowing that I am grasping is enough to end that grasping on a more subtle level. But of course, until we reach that point, things appear to us to last a long time, to have permanence, because we are superimposing permanence and grasping at it, because we like things to stay the same. Yeah, we like stuff to stay the same and then get upset when it changes. But in fact, it was always going to change. That was its nature. And so we can look at this 2 ways. How long can we grasp? As long as we hold on to it, sure. But fundamentally, with awareness, things are changing moment to moment. I hope that helps. There's another question here. Shall the meditation eventually change from focusing on the breath to being solely in open awareness, and to learn to remain there for as long as one can? This is a great question. This sounds like a Buddhist practitioner to me. Absolutely. Mindfulness is a tool. We do mindfulness as a method, as a path, but not to stay on the path forever. And it has a purpose, as I said, insight. So we need to slowly learn to recognize awareness. And so that involves resting on an object, as I mentioned, and slowly becoming more familiar with the knowing aspect of that, and then allowing our mind to settle until that mud in the clear glass settles enough. And once it settles, then we can recognize awareness. To take another analogy, if we think of that mud as being clouds in the sky, all of the thought and emotion that we constantly experience, as a blanket of cloud that's completely unending and obscures the clear sky and the sun. So if the cloud is continually covering the sky and there's no break in this cloud cover, then, as Rinpoche says, when he asks the question, how would we know that we have Buddha nature? Similarly, if we'd never seen a break in the clouds, how would we know the clarity of the blue sky, the radiance of the sun that was always present? We simply hadn't seen it before. And so one of the developmental points along the path of mindfulness training is exactly as you mentioned here, getting our mind to rest still long enough on this object that all of the movement, the contents just settle enough that there's a break in the continuity of this unending stream of spontaneous and effortless content that's always arising. And when we have just a momentary break, we catch a glimpse of the clarity of the clear sky and the radiance of the sun. And it may be just a moment, but once we recognize that, you're absolutely right, we can become more and more familiar with that experience. And then the non-forgetfulness, which is mindfulness, becomes not forgetting the breath, not forgetting awareness. And as you say, resting in open awareness. And this is where we're encouraged then to train in this in small moments. And we can imagine what this would be like, right? Generally, our mindfulness practice is about returning to the breath when we get distracted, caught up in our minds, and we return to the breath. And it can be a calming experience. But at some point, imagine that you had this recognition and familiarity with mind, so that each time you wandered, the thing you returned to wasn't the breath. It was the abiding, unconditioned ground of open awareness. And that was where you returned to. And that was, as it were, your home. Well, this is what the text encourages us to aim for. Wonderful. Okay, there's another question. Rinpoche wrote, what you think you see, hear, taste, etc. While I think I might have misheard, you mistakenly read what you see, hear, think. And that's an interesting difference. Or is it? Seeing versus what we think we're seeing. Oh, maybe I misread it. Let's go back and have a look at the text just briefly. Let me just close this. Okay, so this section here. While you're alive, everything you think you see, hear, and taste. Yes, you're absolutely right. As Rinpoche says, we think we see them. We think we hear them. As I mentioned, we are subject to these appearances and we accept them. So we think this is what I see. This is what I hear. Well, I'm aware that the time looks like it's up. So thank you all very, very much for attending. It's been a real pleasure and an honor for me to contribute in a very small way to this wonderful program and just to read through a little bit of Rinpoche's text. And I'm going to hand over now back to Sering.
Thank you, Ben. Wow, a lot of insights and excellent teaching on mindfulness. And I myself am looking forward to putting some of those instructions into practice. I think we would all benefit from that if we can spend some time in this week coming. If you'd like to learn more from Ben on the topic of mindfulness, he can be contacted at Pramana Wellbeing in Palmwoods on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, or by email benisbel@hotmail.com. So next week's session, we're going to have Zongsa Khyentse Rinpoche giving the Lung via a recording of the refined essence of oral instructions, Guru Rinpoche's heart advice to Khandro Yeshe Sogyo on what to do at the time of death. And this is just so special, and please don't miss it. And now Annie Sangma will screen share the dedication. You just join me, please. This virtuous accumulation of merit we offer, so that all obstacles dissolve, and at the time of our death, each of us may find ease in dying and swift rebirth in the pure land of great bliss, quickly gaining enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to Ben. It was really excellent.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.